The hardest part was not being stood up. It was realizing everyone else had noticed. Sarah Mitchell stared at the empty chair across from her and checked the time again. 52 minutes. Not that she was counting anymore. The small cafe in downtown Columbus buzzed with the comfortable sounds of a Friday evening. Couples laughed over coffee. Friends shared desserts. A family near the window celebrated a birthday. Meanwhile, Sarah sat alone at a table meant for two. She smoothed the sleeve of her navy blouse and forced herself not to look at the entrance again. 6 years. That was how long it had been since her last real date. 6 years spent raising her daughter Emma, working full-time at a medical office, paying bills, helping with homework, and convincing herself that she did not need anything more. Then 3 weeks ago, after encouragement from a coworker, she had reluctantly joined an online dating app. Most conversations had gone nowhere. Then she met Michael. He seemed kind, polite, stable. After several phone calls, they agreed to meet for coffee. Sarah had almost canceled 3 different times. Now she wished she had. Her phone vibrated against the table. For one hopeful second, her heart lifted. Then she looked at the screen. A text message. Not an apology. Not an explanation she could respect. Just a few careless words. Sorry. Something came up. Maybe another time. Sarah stared at the message. No phone call. No warning. No effort. Just a sentence ending something that had barely begun. Around her, the cafe continued moving as if nothing had happened. Yet Sarah suddenly felt exposed. The young waitress who had refilled her coffee twice gave her a sympathetic smile. A couple at a nearby table glanced over before quickly looking away. Heat rushed into Sarah's face. She grabbed her purse and considered leaving immediately. What had she been thinking? At 34 years old, she should have known better than to get her hopes up. She should have known better than to believe that life might still have surprises waiting for her. Her thoughts drifted to Emma. Her 10-year-old daughter was spending the evening with Sarah's sister. Before leaving home, Emma had hugged her and whispered, "Mom, I hope you have fun tonight." Sarah had smiled and promised she would. Now the memory only made her chest ache. She reached for her purse again. This time she stood. Then a sudden burst of rain appeared outside the large front windows. People on the sidewalk hurried for cover as dark clouds rolled across the evening sky. Sarah sighed and sat back down. Leaving in the middle of a downpour suddenly seemed less appealing. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and stared out at the rain. Across the cafe, a man sitting alone near the window looked up briefly from a book. Their eyes met for only a moment before Sarah looked away. She did not know it yet, but the worst date of her life was only minutes away from becoming the most important evening she had experienced in years. Sarah kept her eyes on the rain outside and hoped the evening would end quietly. The last thing she wanted was attention. Unfortunately, embarrassment had a way of making every glance from a stranger feel larger than it really was. She reached for her purse again and considered calling her sister to pick up Emma early so she could simply go home and forget the entire night. Before she could stand, a voice beside her spoke gently. "I hope this does not sound strange, but I think you deserve a better evening than the one you are having." Sarah looked up in surprise. The man from the window table stood a few feet away holding a coffee cup. Up close, he appeared to be in his early 40s, dressed simply in a dark jacket and light blue shirt. His expression carried no pity, only kindness. Sarah immediately felt cautious. "That depends," she replied. "Are you selling something?" The man laughed softly. "Only conversation. And even that is optional." Against her better judgment, Sarah smiled. It was the first genuine smile she had managed all evening. "That was actually not a terrible answer," she admitted. "I practiced it for almost 10 seconds before walking over here." Sarah laughed despite herself. Several nearby customers returned to their own conversations. The uncomfortable spotlight she had imagined suddenly felt much smaller. The man gestured toward the empty chair. "Would it be completely inappropriate if I sat down for a few minutes? The rain is not stopping anytime soon, and I have already finished my book." Sarah hesitated. Every responsible instinct told her to decline. Yet another part of her recognized something unusual. He was not flirting. He was not trying to impress her. He seemed genuinely concerned that a stranger had been left sitting alone. 5 minutes, she said. "That sounds fair." He sat down and extended his hand. "Daniel Carter." Sarah shook it. "Sarah Mitchell." For the next several minutes, the conversation remained surprisingly easy. Daniel never asked about the date directly. Instead, they talked about the weather, coffee, and the endless construction projects around Columbus. Sarah found herself relaxing. There was something disarming about the way he listened. Most people waited for their turn to speak. Daniel actually seemed interested in what she said. Eventually, he glanced at the untouched dessert sitting in front of her. "I am going to make an assumption," he said carefully. "That dessert was originally intended for 2 people." Sarah groaned and covered her face. "Please do not remind me." Daniel smiled sympathetically. "Then I have a proposal." Sarah narrowed her eyes. "Should I be worried? Probably not. Life is unpredictable. Bad dates happen. But nobody should have to waste perfectly good chocolate cake." Sarah laughed again. This time the laughter felt effortless. The waitress, noticing the change, smiled as she walked past. For the first time all evening, Sarah no longer felt like the woman who had been abandoned at a table. She felt like herself again. Neither she nor Daniel realized it yet. But what began as a brief conversation between strangers was quietly becoming the first chapter of a story neither of them could have imagined. The rain continued falling outside long after Sarah expected it to stop. What began as a 5-minute conversation somehow stretched into nearly an hour. Neither of them seemed to notice. The untouched dessert eventually disappeared, shared between 2 strangers who had started the evening expecting completely different things. Sarah found herself laughing more than she had in months. It felt strange, not because Daniel was trying particularly hard to be funny, but because he made conversation feel effortless. There was no pressure to impress anyone, no awkward silence, no need to carefully choose every word. For the first time in a very long while, Sarah felt comfortable simply being herself. At one point, Daniel glanced toward the front window where the rain still covered the glass. "I think Columbus may have decided nobody is leaving tonight," he said. Sarah smiled. "That would explain why I am still here. And here I thought it was my sparkling personality." Sarah laughed and shook her head. "Do not get carried away." The conversation slowly moved beyond small talk. Daniel asked about her work. Sarah explained that she worked in administration for a medical practice. It was not glamorous, but it paid the bills. Mostly. Daniel listened carefully. Then he asked about her family. Normally, Sarah avoided discussing personal details with people she had just met. Yet something about Daniel made openness feel natural. "I have a daughter," she said. "Emma. She is 10. Daniel's expression immediately softened. "Tell me about her." The question surprised Sarah. Most people asked out of politeness. Daniel sounded genuinely interested. Before she realized it, she was sharing stories about Emma's science projects, her obsession with reading mystery novels, and her habit of asking impossible questions right before bedtime. Daniel smiled throughout every story. "She sounds remarkable." Sarah's face brightened instantly. "She is." For a moment, she forgot the disappointment that had brought her there in the first place. Across the table, Daniel noticed the change. It was impossible not to. Whenever Sarah talked about her daughter, a different energy appeared. The exhaustion she carried seemed to disappear. Several minutes later, Sarah glanced at the clock and looked surprised. "I should probably get home." Daniel checked the time and laughed softly. "I suppose we have officially exceeded the 5-minute agreement." "By a little. Only by about 55 minutes. Sarah gathered her purse, still smiling. Then a strange thought crossed her mind. She realized she did not want the conversation to end. The realization caught her completely off guard. As they stood near the entrance, the rain had finally slowed to a light drizzle. For a brief moment, neither moved toward the door. "Well," Sarah said, "thank you." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "For what?" Sarah considered the question. "For rescuing a very bad evening." Daniel smiled warmly. "I think you rescued it yourself." For a second, they simply stood there looking at each other. Then Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card. "In case you ever need someone to help finish abandoned desserts again." Sarah laughed and accepted it. A few minutes later, she drove home through damp city streets. The disappointment of the canceled date no longer felt like the most important part of the evening. Meanwhile, Daniel remained outside the cafe watching her car disappear into traffic. For reasons he could not fully explain, he found himself hoping that this would not be the last time he saw Sarah Mitchell. For the next several days, Sarah surprised herself by thinking about Daniel more often than she intended. It was not because she believed anything extraordinary had happened. They had shared coffee, conversation, and a piece of chocolate cake. That was all. Yet somehow the memory stayed with her. Monday morning quickly returned her to reality. Emma needed help finding a missing homework folder. A stack of bills waited on the kitchen counter. Work was busy as always. Life moved forward exactly as it had before. Still, every now and then, Sarah found herself smiling when she remembered a particular joke or comment from that rainy evening. By Wednesday afternoon, she noticed Daniel's business card still sitting inside her purse. She had almost thrown it away several times. Instead, she kept carrying it. After work, she picked up Emma from school and drove home. During dinner, Emma immediately sensed something different. "You seem happier," Emma said while poking at a plate of pasta. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Do I?" Emma nodded confidently. "Definitely." Sarah laughed. "Maybe I just had a good week." Emma studied her suspiciously. "Or maybe somebody made you smile." Children, Sarah realized, missed very little. The following Saturday, Sarah took Emma to a local bookstore. While Emma disappeared into the children's section, Sarah wandered through the aisles looking for a new novel. As she reached for a book on a display shelf, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Normally, she ignored unfamiliar calls. This time, she answered. "Hello. I am taking a risk here," a familiar voice said. Sarah immediately smiled. "Daniel. Good. I was worried you might have forgotten me. You are the man who stole half my dessert." Daniel laughed. "I remember it differently." Sarah leaned against a bookshelf, trying not to smile too obviously. "Of course you do." The conversation lasted only a few minutes, yet it felt surprisingly natural. Daniel explained that he happened to be visiting Columbus again for work and wanted to check on her. The simplicity of the gesture caught her off guard. Most people disappeared after one pleasant conversation. Daniel had actually remembered. Before ending the call, he made a suggestion. "There is a farmer's market downtown tomorrow morning. Emma might enjoy it." Sarah hesitated. Daniel quickly added, "No pressure. I just thought you might like the recommendation." The next morning, Sarah and Emma decided to go. What she did not know was that Daniel would be there as well. They spotted him near a stand selling fresh pastries. Emma immediately noticed him before Sarah did. "Mom, that is the cake guy." Sarah nearly laughed out loud. Daniel turned and smiled when he saw them. What followed felt unexpectedly comfortable. The three of them spent nearly 2 hours walking through the market. Emma asked endless questions. Daniel answered every one of them with patience and genuine interest. By the time they said goodbye, Sarah noticed something she had not expected. Emma liked him. More importantly, Daniel seemed to genuinely enjoy spending time with her daughter. Driving home that afternoon, Sarah found herself replaying the day in her mind. Somewhere between the bookstore phone call and the farmer's market conversation, a simple friendship had quietly begun to take shape. Over the following month, Daniel gradually became a familiar part of Sarah and Emma's lives. Nothing happened quickly. There were no dramatic declarations, no sudden romance, and no grand gestures. Instead, there were simple conversations, occasional lunches, and weekend outings that felt surprisingly natural. Sarah appreciated that Daniel never pushed for more. He seemed content simply spending time with them. Emma, however, had developed her own opinion. One Saturday afternoon after Daniel joined them at a local science museum, Emma climbed into the back seat of Sarah's car and announced, "I like Daniel." Sarah glanced at her daughter through the rearview mirror. "That is good." Emma folded her arms thoughtfully. "No, I mean I really like Daniel." Sarah laughed. "I gathered that." Emma stared out the window for a moment before adding, "He actually listens when people talk." Sarah could not argue with that observation. It was one of the things she appreciated most about him. Daniel had a rare ability to make people feel heard. Yet despite their growing friendship, there was still one subject Daniel carefully avoided. His work. Sarah knew he traveled frequently. She knew he owned several businesses. She knew he attended meetings all over the country. Beyond that, very little. Whenever she asked for details, he answered politely, but vaguely. At first she assumed he valued privacy. Later she began to suspect there was more to the story. One evening, after Emma had gone to bed, Sarah sat on her porch speaking with Daniel on the phone. The summer air was warm and peaceful. "You know," Sarah said casually, "most people can explain their job in one sentence." Daniel laughed softly. "I can explain mine in one sentence." "Then why don't you?" "Because I enjoy watching you try to figure it out." Sarah rolled her eyes even though he could not see her. "That is incredibly annoying." "I know." She smiled despite herself. After ending the call, Sarah found herself thinking about him longer than usual. The realization unsettled her slightly. Somewhere along the way, Daniel had become more than a friend. The problem was that she had no idea whether he felt the same way. Meanwhile, several states away, Daniel sat alone in a private office overlooking the Chicago skyline. Financial reports covered his desk. News channels played quietly on a television mounted to the wall. Assistants moved through nearby offices preparing for meetings scheduled throughout the week. None of it held his attention. Instead, he found himself thinking about Sarah. For months, he had deliberately hidden the true scale of his professional life. Not because he wanted to deceive her, but because he wanted something he rarely experienced. Authenticity. Sarah treated him like a normal person. She challenged him, teased him, disagreed with him. She liked him without knowing anything about his wealth. Unfortunately, Daniel knew the secret could not remain hidden forever. The following week, Sarah arrived at the Columbus airport for a work conference. While waiting near her departure gate, she wandered into a bookstore looking for something to read. As she passed a display featuring business magazines, one cover immediately caught her attention. Her heart nearly stopped. Staring back at her from the front page was a face she recognized instantly. Daniel Carter. Beneath the photograph, a headline described one of the youngest self-made billionaires in America. Sarah stood frozen. For several seconds, she simply stared at the magazine in disbelief. Suddenly, every unanswered question, every vague explanation, and every missing detail began falling into place. The man she thought she knew was hiding a truth far larger than she had ever imagined. Sarah stood motionless in the airport bookstore while travelers moved around her in every direction. The magazine remained in her hands as she read the headline again. Daniel Carter, billionaire entrepreneur, founder of one of the largest investment and technology groups in the country. She blinked several times, convinced she had misunderstood something. Yet the photograph left no room for doubt. It was him. The same man who shared chocolate cake in a cafe. The same man who spent Saturday mornings listening to Emma talk about science projects. The same man who called simply to ask how her day had gone. Suddenly, dozens of conversations replayed in her mind. The frequent business trips. The vague answers about work. The occasional references to meetings in different cities. Somehow she had never connected the pieces. Her phone buzzed. As if the universe had chosen the perfect moment, Daniel's name appeared on the screen. Sarah stared at it for several seconds before answering. Hello. Daniel immediately sensed something different. Everything okay? Sarah looked down at the magazine cover. You tell me. Silence followed. Not a long silence, but long enough. Daniel understood immediately. You found out. Sarah closed her eyes briefly. I found a magazine. Another pause. Then Daniel exhaled slowly. I was hoping to tell you myself. Sarah left the bookstore and found an empty seat near her departure gate. Her emotions felt surprisingly complicated. She was not angry. At least not entirely. She was confused. Hurt. Overwhelmed. Why didn't you tell me? She asked quietly. Daniel answered honestly. Because I was afraid. The response caught her off guard. Billionaires were not supposed to sound afraid. Afraid of what? Daniel's voice softened. That you would see me differently. Sarah looked through the airport windows toward the runway. Part of her wanted to argue. Another part knew he might be right. The truth had changed how she saw him, even if she wished it had not. You should have trusted me, she said. I know. There was genuine regret in his voice. That made the conversation harder, not easier. The following week felt different. Sarah did not ignore Daniel completely, but she pulled back. Their daily phone calls became shorter. Text messages took longer to answer. Daniel respected the distance, even though it clearly troubled him. Meanwhile, Sarah struggled with thoughts she could not organize. Everywhere she looked, articles about Daniel seemed to appear. Online interviews, business podcasts, news stories. She learned that his company employed thousands of people. She learned about investments worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She learned that his life was far larger than anything she had imagined. One evening, Emma noticed the change immediately. Did you and Daniel have an argument? Sarah looked up from the kitchen table. Why would you ask that? Emma shrugged. Because you stopped smiling when your phone rings. Children truly noticed everything. Later that night, after Emma was asleep, Sarah sat alone on the porch. Her phone buzzed. Daniel. She almost ignored it. Instead, she answered. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Daniel finally broke the silence. I miss talking to you. The simple honesty caught her off guard. Sarah closed her eyes and leaned back in her chair. Deep down, she missed him too. The problem was not who Daniel really was. The The problem was figuring out whether someone like her still belonged in a world that seemed so different from her own. The days that followed felt strangely unfinished. Sarah tried to convince herself that creating distance was the responsible thing to do. Every logical argument supported the decision. Daniel lived in a world she barely understood. His schedule, responsibilities, and public profile belonged to a completely different reality. Yet logic proved surprisingly ineffective whenever she found herself remembering the small moments instead. She remembered him carrying Emma's science fair project across a parking lot because it was too heavy. She remembered him listening patiently to stories that most people would have considered unimportant. She remembered the way he always treated her opinions as valuable. None of those memories had anything to do with money. One Saturday morning, Sarah sat at the kitchen table reviewing household expenses while Emma worked on homework nearby. The numbers were tighter than usual. Unexpected car repairs had disrupted her monthly budget. Sarah rubbed her forehead and reached for a calculator. Across the table, Emma quietly watched her. "Mom." Sarah looked up. "What is it?" Emma hesitated before speaking. "Are you sad because of Daniel?" Sarah managed a small smile. "That is a very direct question." Emma shrugged. "You always tell me honesty is important." Sarah could not argue with that. She closed the calculator and leaned back in her chair. "I do not know if I am sad." Emma considered this. "Then why do you look sad?" Children had a remarkable ability to find truths adults tried to avoid. Before Sarah could answer, Emma continued. "Daniel is still the same person." The statement landed harder than Sarah expected. Later that afternoon, after dropping Emma off at a friend's birthday party, Sarah found herself driving without a destination. Almost without realizing it, she ended up near the same cafe where everything had started months earlier. The building looked exactly the same. People came and went through the entrance. Conversations continued behind the windows. Life moved forward. Sarah sat inside her parked car and stared at the familiar storefront. Her phone buzzed. A text message appeared. "Daniel, I am in Columbus today. No pressure. No expectations. But I would like to see you if you are willing." Sarah stared at the screen. Her heart immediately responded before her mind could interfere. An hour later, she walked into the cafe. Daniel was already there. For a brief moment, neither moved. Then he stood. The months of friendship and weeks of distance suddenly seemed to exist between them at the same time. "Hi," he said quietly. "Hi." They sat down at the same table where they had first met. The irony was impossible to ignore. Daniel smiled faintly. "At least nobody abandoned this table today." Sarah laughed despite herself. The tension immediately softened. For nearly 2 hours they talked honestly. Daniel explained why he had hidden the truth. Sarah explained why discovering it had frightened her. Neither interrupted. Neither became defensive. When the conversation finally paused, Daniel looked directly at her. "Sarah, I never wanted you to be impressed by my success." His voice remained calm and sincere. "The person I hoped would like me was the woman who shared dessert with a stranger during a rainstorm." Sarah felt tears gathering unexpectedly. Not because of his wealth, not because of his status, but because for the first time since learning the truth, she believed him completely. And somewhere deep inside, a wall she had been carefully maintaining finally began to crack. After that afternoon at the cafe, something shifted between Sarah and Daniel. The uncertainty that had hovered over them for weeks began to fade. Not all at once, and not because every question had been answered, but because honesty had finally replaced assumptions. For the first time since discovering the truth about his life, Sarah felt as though she was seeing Daniel clearly again. More importantly, she realized he was still the same man who had walked over to her table on a rainy evening when everyone else had looked away. Over the following weeks, their friendship regained its natural rhythm. Phone calls became longer. Messages arrived throughout the day. Weekend plans no longer felt complicated. One Saturday morning, Daniel joined Sarah and Emma at a community charity event organized by a local elementary school. Children ran between activity booths while parents volunteered throughout the park. Daniel spent nearly an hour helping a group of students build model bridges from craft sticks. Watching him kneel beside the children and patiently answer their questions, Sarah found herself smiling. There was no audience, no reporters, no business advantage, just genuine interest. At one point, Emma pulled Sarah aside. "Can I tell you something?" Sarah laughed. "You usually do." Emma lowered her voice dramatically. "I think Daniel likes you." Sarah nearly choked on her coffee. "Emma." Her daughter grinned. I am just saying. Later that afternoon, as families began leaving the event, Sarah and Daniel found themselves walking alone along a quiet path beside the park. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. For a few moments, neither spoke. The silence felt comfortable rather than awkward. Eventually, Daniel broke it. Can I ask you something? Sarah looked at him. Of course. Daniel took a slow breath. When you found out who I was, what scared you the most? Sarah considered the question carefully. Honestly, always. She looked ahead at the path. I was afraid I would become a project. Daniel frowned slightly. A project? Someone you could fix. Someone you could rescue. Daniel stopped walking. Sarah turned toward him. His expression carried genuine surprise. Sarah, I have never once looked at you that way. The sincerity in his voice immediately caught her attention. Daniel continued. The truth is, one of the things I admire most about you is that you have built your life without anyone rescuing you. Sarah felt emotion rise unexpectedly in her chest. For years, she had worked hard to provide stability for Emma. Most people noticed the struggles. Very few noticed the strength behind them. Daniel always seemed to notice both. Several days later, Sarah shared an old dream she rarely discussed. Years before becoming a mother, she had wanted to create an educational mentoring program for children who needed extra academic support. Life, responsibilities, and financial reality had pushed that dream aside. Instead of offering money or solutions, Daniel simply listened. Then he asked questions, thoughtful questions, encouraging questions, questions that made the dream feel possible again. That evening, after returning home, Sarah sat quietly on her porch while Emma slept upstairs. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a future larger than survival. And as she looked toward that future, she realized something important. She was no longer afraid of Daniel's world. She was beginning to believe there might be room for both of them in the same one. 1 year later, Sarah stood near the entrance of a newly renovated community learning center and watched families arrive from every direction. Children hurried through the doors carrying notebooks and backpacks. Parents followed behind them with curious smiles. Colorful banners decorated the walls. Volunteers prepared registration tables. The building buzzed with excitement and possibility. For a moment, Sarah simply stood there and took everything in. Years earlier, this place had existed only as a quiet dream she rarely mentioned. Now it was real. The mentoring program she had imagined for so long was finally opening its doors. The journey had not been easy. There had been permits, fundraising, planning meetings, endless paperwork, and countless obstacles. Yet somehow, step by step, the dream had become reality. Not because someone handed it to her, but because she finally believed it was worth pursuing. A familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. You should probably go inside. They are all waiting for you. Sarah turned and smiled immediately. Daniel stood beside her, looking just as calm and confident as ever. Some things had changed over the past year. Others had not. His success no longer intimidated her. His wealth no longer seemed like the most important thing about him. The man standing beside her was still the same person who had sat down at a cafe table when she needed kindness more than she needed advice. Nearby, Emma adjusted a volunteer badge hanging around her neck. At 11 years old, she had become one of the center's most enthusiastic supporters. Mom, she called out. Everybody is ready. Sarah laughed. I am coming. Together they walked inside. The room quickly grew quiet as Sarah stepped toward the front. Looking across the audience, she saw teachers, parents, students, community leaders, and neighbors who had supported the project. Then she noticed Daniel and Emma standing together near the first row. Both smiled encouragingly. Suddenly, Sarah remembered another evening from long ago. A rainy night. An empty chair. A canceled date. At the time, she believed her evening had been ruined. Looking back now, she realized something different. Life had simply redirected her toward a better story. Sarah took a slow breath and began speaking. She talked about opportunity, about resilience, about children who deserved encouragement and support. She spoke about believing in possibilities even when circumstances suggested otherwise. As the audience listened, Sarah felt something she had not experienced in years. Complete confidence. Not because life had become perfect, not because every challenge had disappeared, but because she finally trusted herself. After the event ended, families remained for tours and activities. Laughter filled the building. Children explored classrooms. Parents asked questions. The center was alive. Later that afternoon, as the crowd gradually dispersed, Sarah stepped outside into the warm sunshine. Daniel joined her a few moments later. Neither spoke immediately. They simply watched children playing nearby. Finally, Daniel smiled. You know, if someone had told me a year ago that getting caught in a rainstorm would lead here, I would not have believed them. Sarah laughed softly. Neither would I. Daniel looked at her. I'm glad I walked over to that table. Sarah felt her heart warm. Me too. Stand